So imagine you're just walking down a perfectly normal, busy city block in St. Louis, Missouri.
Right, just a regular Tuesday commute.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cars are driving by, people are walking their dogs, maybe you've got a coffee in your hand. But I want you to imagine that right beneath your feet, buried under thick layers of asphalt and dirt, is just this massive 19th century brick-lined cavern.
And we are just talking about like an empty natural cave here.
No, not at all. We're talking about a hand-paved cavern that once held literally tens of thousands of gallons of lagering beer.
Just an incredible image.
It really is. And it's completely silent down there right now, totally dark, and almost entirely forgotten by the people walking just a few feet above it.
We really do just go through our daily lives completely trusting the ground we walk on, right? Totally unaware of these massive historical voids hiding just below the pavement.
We really do. Well, welcome back, Deep Divers. I'm your host, and today we're turning this deep dive into a classroom. Grab your notebooks because we're going below the surface.
We've got a lot of ground to cover today. Or, well, underground to cover.
Yeah, literally. Today, we are guiding you through the hidden subterranean world of St. Louis. We're going to explore the geology that birthed an American beer empire. We'll separate real history from some really wild urban legends and discover what actually still survives underground.
It is such a fascinating intersection of geology, industrial innovation, and human imagination.
It really is. And as always, I'm joined by our resident expert and co-instructor to help unpack all these historical records and speleological surveys.
I am so ready for this one. I mean, St. Louis history is wild.
So, class is in session, deep divers. Let's start with the actual ground beneath the city. Because the booming 19th century beer industry in St. Louis, it didn't just happen by accident.
Right. It wasn't just clever marketing.
No, it was entirely dependent on a geographical quirk, specifically karst geology.
That is the absolute foundation of this entire story. If you look at the bedrock around St. Louis, and really a huge part of Missouri in general.
This is actually known as the cave state, right?
Yes, exactly. The cave state. You are looking at Jurassic limestone and dolomite. And the key thing to know here is that these are soluble rocks.
Meaning water can just dissolve them over time.
Right. I mean, over a very, very long time, over millions of years, rainwater, which is naturally just a tiny bit acidic, seeps through cracks in the soil.
Okay.
And as it moves through the limestone, it acts like like a very slow motion solvent. It dissolves the rock and carves out these massive underground drainage systems.
Wow.
Yeah, and that creates what geologists call a karst landscape.
So the ground beneath St. Louis isn't just solid, reliable bedrock. It's essentially geological Swiss cheese.
That's a perfect way to describe it, Swiss cheese.
You've got sinkholes, underground rivers, and natural caves just everywhere. I mean, looking at the notes here, there are over 7,500 recorded caves in Missouri.
Which is just a staggering number when you think about it.
Right. And Washington geologists have mapped out over 127 known caves just in St. Louis County alone. We're talking miles and miles of underground passages. I also saw this term in the research, losing streams. What exactly is a losing stream?
Oh, losing streams are so cool. It's exactly what it sounds like, actually. And it's quite eerie to see in person. It's a surface stream or a creek that just seems to vanish right into the ground.
Just totally disappears.
Yeah, the water is actually dropping into a subterranean crack or a cave system and just continuing its journey completely underground.
That is wild. Okay, but how does this geological Swiss cheese connect to the beer empire?
Well, it all comes down to temperature control.
Okay.
You see, these limestone caves maintain a constant year-round temperature about 55 degrees Fahrenheit.
Which is pretty chilly.
It is. And today, if we want a room to be 55 degrees, we just adjust a thermostat. But in the early to mid-19th century, long before mechanical refrigeration, a constant 55-degree environment was a massive technological advantage.
Especially if you were trying to brew a very specific type of beer.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the German immigrants. Because in the 1830s and 40s, this huge wave of German brewers arrived in St. Louis.
And they wanted to brew traditional lagers.
Right, the beers they knew and loved from back home. But lagers, unlike ales, require cold storage to ferment and age properly. I mean, you absolutely cannot just leave a barrel of lager out in the sweltering Missouri summer heat.
Oh, it would be awful. It will completely ruin the beer.
So these brewers looked at this Swiss cheese ground and realized they were sitting on top of a massive, naturally pre-chilled refrigerator.
And they capitalized on it immediately. I mean, one of the earliest and most famous examples is a guy named John Adam Lemp.
Oh, the Lemp family, yeah.
Right. He arrived in St. Louis in 1838 and eventually built his Cherokee Street brewery directly over one of these massive natural caverns.
And he didn't just stumble upon like a small hole in the ground, right?
No, not at all. By 1845, newspaper accounts were already writing about the sheer scale of Lemp's Cave. It was an absolute marvel.
The scale is what really blows my mind here. Lemp's Cave was roughly 100 yards long and 20 feet wide.
That's a football field.
Literally a football field underground. It was vaulted into 3 massive compartments, and it held around 3,000 barrels of beer. And I think we need to be clear about the physical reality of this space.
Yeah, it wasn't just a dirty cave.
Right, they didn't just roll a few wooden barrels into a muddy hole. They heavily modified these spaces.
They really had to, because a natural cave is damp.
Huh.
Water is constantly dripping from the ceiling. I mean, that's how the cave formed in the first place.
Right, the slow motion solvent.
Exactly. And you can't have groundwater dripping all over your wooden barrels and contaminating your product. So they undertook these incredible feats of engineering.
What'd they do?
Well, they carved out massive entrances for one. They installed paved brick floors so it wasn't a mud pit. And most impressively, they built these beautiful, sweeping stone and brick arched ceilings inside the cave.
Inside the cave.
Yeah.
Like a room within a room.
Exactly. They built these arches to catch the water seepage from the rock and direct it down the sides away from the beer.
That is just incredible. Imagine the physical labor of that.
Yeah.
Moving 3,000 heavy wooden barrels of beer by hand down steep subterranean inclines into a damp 55-degree cave lit only by lanterns.
It was grueling work.
And Lemp wasn't alone in doing this. Other early St. Louis breweries, like Winkelmeyer, Stiefel, and McCo's and English, they all built their cellars over these caves, too.
Yeah, there was a site called English Cave near Merrimack Street that was 256 feet long.
Wow.
Yeah, and it stored 3,500 barrels by 1850. The city's early economic engine was literally humming along inside the bedrock.
So, deep divers, I want you to think about this as an application of what we're learning. Think about running a massive manufacturing business today.
Okay.
Imagine that your most critical piece of equipment, let's say your massive server room or your primary refrigeration unit, is literally a hole in the dirt that you carved out beneath your office.
It really puts it into perspective.
How much does your physical environment dictate your success? For the Lemps, that hole in the ground made them a total empire.
It was their biggest asset.
But relying on nature puts a hard ceiling on how big you can grow, right?
Yeah.
Because if the ground gives you free refrigeration, why would you ever change your business model?
Well, because free refrigeration has a hidden cost, which is that you cannot scale it. You are entirely trapped by the physical size of the rock. You are bound by the location of the cave, and you're bound by the brutal logistics of hauling thousands of heavy barrels up and down those steep shafts using, pulleys and just raw manpower.
You run out of room eventually. So what does a competitor like Anheuser-Busch do in this situation? Did they just spend years hunting around Missouri trying to find an even bigger cave to beat Lemp?
Well, initially they did use what they had. Adolphus Budd actually inherited a cave cellar in 1864. It was known as Schneider's Felsenkeller, which basically translates to rock cellar, and it had originally been cut into a hill for the Bavarian brewery. So the early Anheuser brew houses were built right on top of this old natural cellar.
Makes sense to use it if it's there.
Exactly. But Adolphus Busch was a really visionary businessman. He didn't want the size of his company to be dictated by the size of a limestone void.
He wanted to break free from the geology entirely.
He did. So by the 1870s, under Busch's leadership, Anheuser-Busch began pioneering the use of artificial ammonia refrigeration.
Okay, let's pause here. Let's unpack this for the classroom. How does that actually work? Because we take our kitchen fridges for granted today, but going from a cold rock to artificial cooling, that is a massive leap.
It is a complete paradigm shift for the industry. Instead of relying on the passive, stable temperature of the Earth, ammonia refrigeration is an active chemical process.
Like using science instead of nature.
Right. It uses the phase change of ammonia, so turning it from a liquid to a gas and back again, to actively absorb heat from a room and then pump that heat outside.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it requires heavy machinery, compressors, and extensive piping networks.
But the trade-off is that you have total control over the temperature.
Total control and infinite scalability. Busch started building these massive, highly insulated above-ground ice houses.
Above ground, that's the key.
Exactly. By the time they constructed their new brew house in 1879, it featured two fully built-in sub-level stories that were mechanically cooled by this new technology.
So by mechanizing the cooling process, he rendered the natural caves completely unnecessary. You didn't need to hunt for a cave anymore.
No.
You didn't need to haul barrels up a muddy underground ramp.
Yeah.
You could build a massive, perfectly climate-controlled cold storage facility anywhere you wanted at literally whatever size you could afford to build it.
It is just a textbook example of disruptive technology. The very geological feature that created the St. Louis beer boom suddenly became entirely obsolete.
That's crazy to think about. Yeah, after Bush built his massive 1891 landmark brewery, you hardly saw any new natural caves being utilized for beer. They just weren't needed.
So suddenly, the city is sitting on top of all these massive, brick-lined 55-degree caverns, and they are just sitting there, totally empty.
Just waiting.
Right. Which brings us to the 1920s. What happens to a massive, hidden, sound-dampened underground space when the manufacturing of alcohol suddenly becomes a federal crime?
Well, human nature abhors a vacuum.
Doesn't it just?
Yeah, when Prohibition hit between 1919 and 1933, the legitimate breweries either had to shut down entirely or pivot to making things like soda and near beer. The mighty Lemp Brewery, for instance, just closed its doors.
End of an era.
Truly. And almost overnight, these abandoned hidden spaces became incredibly attractive for illicit activities.
Bootleggers. I mean, it feels like the perfect setting for a gangster movie.
It really does, but we do need to temper the Hollywood image just a bit here.
Fair enough.
If you picture massive, highly organized, brightly lit underground bootlegging cities running for miles beneath St. Louis, you'll be disappointed. It wasn't quite that cinematic.
Okay, so no underground speakeasy empires.
Right. However, the spaces were absolutely used. Groups like CARN, which is the Cave Archaeology Investigation Research Network, have actually conducted modern excavations in some of these old cellar spaces.
Wait, before we go further, for those of us taking notes in the classroom, speleology, Karen. Speleology is just the scientific study of caves, right?
Yes, speleology is the study of cave environments, how they form, and the history hidden inside them.
Got it. And what did these modern cave archaeologists actually find in St. Louis?
Oh, it's fascinating. In the dirt and the loose fill that eventually settled into these caves over the decades, they've dug up hidden, sealed-off liquor bottles that perfectly date back to the Prohibition era.
No way. So it literally proves that they were being used as ad hoc speakeasies or hidden
It's used opportunistically, yeah. If you think about it from a bootlegger's perspective, it makes perfect sense.
Oh, absolutely.
If you need to hide an illicit distilling operation from federal agents, an abandoned, sound-dampened, thermally stable cave that you can only access through a hidden basement door is a pretty ideal setup.
It really is. So deep divers, here's another thought experiment for you. Look around your own city today at abandoned spaces. An empty big box mall, a forgotten subway terminal, a shuttered factory.
We all have those spaces.
Right. When a space loses its legitimate public purpose, how quickly does it become a site for something hidden, private, or taboo? It happens almost instantly, doesn't it?
It really does. And what's really interesting is that dark, empty, and hidden spaces don't just breed physical illicit activity, they breed rumors.
Oh, without doubt.
Yeah, when you have an entire city going to sleep every night on top of empty, inaccessible voids, human imagination just goes into overdrive to fill those voids with stories.
When history is physically buried and we can't see it for ourselves, we tend to fill the gaps with some incredibly wild folklore.
Yeah.
We really have to rely on primary records to separate the actual mundane history from these persistent urban legends.
And St. Louis has absolutely no shortage of subterranean urban legends to choose from.
Let's look at the two biggest ones that always come up. First, the famous Lemp Mansion secret commuter tunnel.
Oh, this is a classic.
The legend goes that the incredibly wealthy Lemp family built this sprawling, opulent, private, underground tunnel connecting their Fayette mansion directly to the Cherokee Street Brewery.
Right.
And the story implies they did this so they could commute to work underground without having to mingle with the commoners on the street level.
It is a phenomenal story. I mean, you see it repeated on Wikipedia. It's a total staple on haunted house tours, and it's firmly embedded in local St. Louis lore.
Okay.
But the only problem is it's completely unverified and almost certainly false.
I love when architectural historians bring the hammer down on a good ghost story. How did they actually debunk this one?
By doing the unglamorous work of checking the actual records.
Paperwork never lies.
Exactly. Historians like Chris Knapziger have done deep dives into the archival blueprints of the city, the original maps, and the structural realities of the neighborhood. They looked at probate documents, and they prove that there never was any cave access from the Lemp Mansion. The mansion on Lemp Avenue technically sits adjacent to the broader cave system geographically, but it is not directly above it.
So there's no secret door in the basement.
None. There are no maps, no architectural drawings, and zero archaeological evidence that has ever shown a passage connecting the house to the brewery cellars.
So it's completely made up.
The myth is based entirely on the family's massive wealth, their known use of caves for the brewery, and a generous sprinkling of modern theatrical storytelling.
It's an unverified legend. People just really love the idea of billionaires having secret underground lairs. But there's another set of tunnel rumors in St. Louis that carries a lot more emotional and historical weight, even though the tunnels themselves are myths. And that's the lore of the Underground Railroad cave tunnels.
Right. This is a much more complex one to talk about.
Yet,
Because St. Louis was a major border city in a slave state, sitting right on the edge of the Mississippi River, across from a free state. Right. So it has a very real, very active Underground Railroad history. Over the years, this deeply rooted oral tradition developed, one that is often repeated in local tours, claiming that there was a slave tunnel under 3314 Lemp Avenue.
okay.
The story says this tunnel led through the natural caves directly to the edge of the Mississippi River, allowing enslaved people to escape entirely underground.
But again, when we actually look at the primary sources for the deep dives of the U.S. Army Engineers offices, the historical survey record, there is zero primary evidence of these extensive fugitive slave caves.
Nothing in the records at all.
No archaeological trace has ever been found of a tunnel connecting those residential houses to the river through the cave system.
And this is where historians really urge caution. We have to be very careful not to let an alluring myth overshadow the actual documented history of these people.
Exactly. Because the real Underground Railroad history in St. Louis didn't happen in a magical subterranean tunnel. It happened above ground, in the real world, under immense threat of violence.
Yes. The most historically verified event is the Mary Meacham Freedom Crossing of 1855.
Mary Meacham's story is just incredible. She was a free black woman of immense bravery who helped a small group of enslaved people attempt an escape.
A very dangerous escape.
Very dangerous.
Yeah.
But she didn't lead them through a dry, secret, cinematic cave tunnel. She helped them cross the massive, fast-moving, treacherous Mississippi River by boat in the dead of night into Illinois.
And she was actually caught by authorities and arrested for doing this?
She was. The physical danger she and those she helped faced was staggering. In recent years, the National Park Service has actually honored her actions by adding the Mary Meacham Freedom Crossing to the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom.
Which is well-deserved. The real heroes of the Underground Railroad in St. Louis were operating in the open air, facing immediate physical danger from slave catchers in the elements, not sneaking through imaginary caverns.
So, deep divers, why do you think we do this? Why do we prefer the cinematic, almost fantastical myth of a secret underground tunnel over the incredibly brave, real-world reality of someone like Mary Meacham crossing a deadly river by boat?
It's a really fascinating psychological quirk.
It is. Maybe we romanticize the underground because it feels secretive and physically safe. The reality of crossing the Mississippi River is brutal, cold, and totally exposed.
I think we project our desire for a clean, adventurous narrative onto the blank canvas of the unknown. And because these caves have been physically inaccessible for so long, they just remain a perfect blank canvas for our imaginations.
That makes a lot of sense. But that raises a very practical question for our lesson today. If the sprawling commuter tunnels are a myth, and the breweries moved their operations above ground because of artificial refrigeration, what actually happened to the real physical caves that Lemp and others carved out?
Unfortunately, the story of the caves in the mid-20th century is largely a story of destruction.
Yeah, the research on this part is pretty sad.
As the city expanded and modernized, urban development actively destroyed or permanently sealed away a massive portion of St. Louis's subterranean heritage.
Because, if you think about it, to a mid-century civil engineer trying to build a modern metropolis, a massive underground cavern isn't a historical treasure.
No, it's a structural liability.
Exactly. You can't exactly build a massive highway interchange on top of a hollow limestone void.
You really cannot. And one of the most tragic examples of this mindset is the fate of the Cherokee Cave Museum.
This part of the research genuinely breaks my heart. Tell the class about the museum.
So, in the 1940s and early 50s, a portion of the old Cherokee Cave system was actually open to the public as a popular underground tourist attraction.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, you could pay admission, go down there, see the natural limestone formations, and learn about the history of the space. It was this amazing, tangible connection to the city's past.
But then came the interstate highway system.
Yep. In 1957, the Missouri Department of Transportation decided they needed to route Interstate 55 right through that specific area.
And they didn't just build around it.
They didn't build around it at all. They literally bulldozed the museum site, filled the spectacular caverns with rubble, dirt, and concrete, and paved a massive highway directly over it.
They just erased it from the map.
Completely erased it.
And it wasn't just highway projects doing this, right?
Yeah.
Throughout the 20th century, city engineers doing routine sewer work or contractors trying to dig deep residential basements would constantly hit these old brewery voids.
All the time.
And the standard operating procedure wasn't to preserve them. It was to treat them like subterranean landfills. They just dump loose fill into them, brick them over, and pump them full of concrete.
But the irony is that treating these massive geological features as mere annoyances to be paved over, well, it has caused lasting engineering headaches that persist today.
Because you can't just fill a cave with loose dirt and expect it to hold up a city forever, can you?
Precisely. Today, sections of Cherokee Street still have warning signs and frequently experience sinkholes. The loose fill that was dumped into the caves decades ago slowly settles over time. Furthermore, the underground water hasn't stopped moving. I mean, it's karst geology, remember?
Right. The slow-motion solvent is still working.
Exactly. It continues to erode the limestone around the old, backfilled brewery cellars. The ground gives way, and suddenly the asphalt above just collapses.
It's basically the geology fighting back.
Yeah.
You can pave over the past, but it's still down there holding the street up.
That's a great way to put it.
However, the story doesn't end entirely with concrete and sinkholes, does it? There are some incredible modern reclamations happening right now.
Yes, this is a much more optimistic chapter. In 2022, a local St. Louis brewery called Earthbound Beer, which happens to be located right on Cherokee Street, decided to embrace this history.
I love this part.
They actually partnered with speleological groups to excavate a portion of a filled-in 19th century log-ring cave beneath their building.
So they literally dug through the mid-century rubble and concrete.
Yes, they hauled out the dirt by hand and actually cleaned out the original 19th century brickwork.
That is dedication.
You really did it. And they are currently using that subterranean space to age historical beers once again. They even offer guided public tours of the space, allowing people to walk exactly where the early brewers walked.
That is just incredible. So, after more than a century of technological innovation driving brewers out of the caves and decades of urban development literally burying them under highways, a modern St. Louis brewery is returning to its roots and pulling that history back into the light.
It really brings the whole story full circle.
It does. Deep divers, next time you're driving on a massive interstate or pulling your car into a multi-level subterranean parking garage, take a second to wonder what geographical or historical wonders might have been leveled, filled, or blasted away just to pave your commute.
It definitely changes how you view the built environment around you.
It really does.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground today. Could you synthesize our key takeaways from the deep dive for the class?
Absolutely. The core lesson here starts with geology. St. Louis's unique karst landscape, that soluble limestone and dolomite bedrock created thousands of caves.
The Swiss cheese.
Right, the Swiss cheese. These caves provided the perfect, constant 55-degree natural refrigeration that birthed the city's booming 19th century lagering beer industry. However, technological innovation, specifically Adolphus Busch's pioneering use of artificial ammonia refrigeration in the 1870s, allowed brewers to scale beyond the constraints of geology, making those caves completely obsolete.
And once those spaces were abandoned, they fueled decades of wild urban legends. From opportunistic prohibition bootlegging to those completely debunked Lemp Mansion commuter tunnels, the empty caves became a blank canvas for folklore.
And we learn that relying on primary sources is vital. It shows us that the real heroes of the era, like Mary Meacham on the Underground Railroad, operated bravely in the dangerous world above ground, not in mythical subterranean passageways. Finally, mid-20th century infrastructure, like the construction of Interstate 55, treated these historical marvels as engineering hazards, backfilling and burying them. But today, passionate local historians and brewers are slowly working to excavate the rubble and preserve the truth of what lies beneath the city.
Beautifully summarized. So, deep divers, what does this all mean for you today? I'm going to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Think about the purely mundane, functional underground infrastructure we are building right now in our modern cities.
Okay.
The massive concrete parking garages, the deep subway access tunnels, the utility corridors under skyscrapers. In 150 years, when our current technology is totally obsolete, and those concrete spaces are sealed up, abandoned, and forgotten by the public, what wild, supernatural, or conspiratorial urban legends will future citizens invent about us?
That is a fascinating prospect. We are essentially pouring the concrete for the archaeological mysteries of the future.
We absolutely are. Well, thank you for joining me for this deep dive into the hidden world of St. Louis. I hope you learned something new in the classroom today.
It was a pleasure to be here.
And to our listeners, I encourage you to go question an urban legend in your own hometown. Dig into the primary sources and see what you find. And before you go, please like and subscribe to the show, click on our affiliate marketing links in the description, grab some of our exclusive fourth wall merchandise, and drop a comment below suggesting what topic we should teach in our next lesson. See you next time, and keep questioning what's beneath the surface.